I have sat on the bench of more courtrooms than I can count. I have watched fortunes change hands, watched pride swallow itself whole, watched certainty become embarrassment inside the span of a single afternoon. I thought at 73 that I was done being astonished. That was before the night of the Harcastle Harvest Ball. Eustace Harcastle hosted it every autumn at Broadfield Manor, his estate out beyond the Ridge Road, a ballroom that could swallow a church and still have room for the pews. He had made his fortune in cattle and had never once let anyone forget it. He measured every man who entered his house against himself, and he always won. I had been a guest at that ball for 11 consecutive years for the table, and because it was the one evening when the old ranching families and the young professional class sat in the same room and pretended they were all the same species. The evening I am telling you about, Harcastle was in high spirits. He'd just completed the sale of 600 head at a remarkable price and wore as a satisfaction the way other men wore a pocket watch, openly and with the full expectation that you would notice. I was by the fireplace with old Reverend Cates when I first noticed the boy. He was standing near the far wall beside the serving table, plain as a nail in a silk curtain, maybe 22, 23, in a shirt that had been pressed but not tailored, collar slightly off center, boots that had been polished but still remembered mud. He had the forearms and the posture of someone who had spent his life doing work that required both. I would learn his name later. Cody Raines, third-year stable hand at Broadfield, the young man who kept Harcastle's horses and, as I eventually understood it, had been brought inside this one evening at the specific request of Mrs. Harcastle, who had a sharp eye for the people on her property and a somewhat warmer heart than her husband. He was not supposed to be noticed. He was there, I think, the way a good piece of furniture is there. Useful, present, expected to stay quiet. It was Harcastle himself who broke that arrangement. He had gathered a small audience by the piano, a 9-foot Bosendorfer that sat in the corner of the ballroom with the self-possession of something that knew its own worth. A retired colonel had just finished a passable but effortful rendition of a folk song that had earned polite applause and one genuine wince from Harcastle's eldest daughter. Harcastle was refilling the colonel's glass and scanning the room in the way he did when he was working toward an idea, and his eye landed on Cody Raines. Raines, he called out. Not loudly, he never needed volume. The room was attentive to him by habit. The boy looked up. Come over here, he came, quietly, the way he likely moved among the horses. No wasted motion, no theater. Harcastle gestured at the Bosendorfer. My wife tells me you've been playing this instrument in the evenings. When you thought the house was empty, there was a pause in the room. Not a dramatic one, but the kind of pause that tells you something has shifted, that a story has just announced itself. The boy said nothing. He didn't deny it. Harcastle's smile widened. She says you're quite something. He let the word sit there. A small cruelty dressed up as a compliment. Well, let's see it then. The colonel has just done us proud. Let's see what the stable hand can manage. Someone in the back tittered. A few others had the grace to look at their glasses. I set down my drink. Play us something real. Harcastle continued, warming to himself now. The audience arranged itself around him the way audiences do when they sense blood in the water. None of your basic scales, mind you. Give us a proper piece. Something, oh, I don't know, something that would suit the room. He swept his arm to indicate the chandelier, the velvet, the wine. Then he laughed, and it was a laugh I had heard before in courtrooms, from men who were quite certain the ruling was going to go their way. Tell you what, he said, and here the room went quieter, because that tone, the tone of a man arrived at the part of the evening he planned all along, was unmistakable. You play this thing tonight, play it properly, like a real musician, and I will deed you the gray mare. Salome, the 4-year-old. He said the horse's name, the way you say the name of something you are completely confident the other person can never have. Salome was the finest animal on the property. Everyone in that room who knew horses knew her. Harcastle had turned down a figure for that mare 2 months prior that had left the buyer's jaw on the floor. Eustace, Mrs. Harcastle said quietly, from somewhere behind me. He waved a hand. Perfectly fair wager, my dear. The boy plays, really plays, and the mare is his. And if he can't manage it, we all have a pleasant little story for the ride home. Another laugh, inviting the room to join. Several did. Cody Raines had stood through all of this with an expression I could not read. He was not pale with humiliation, nor flushed with anger. He looked, if anything, like a man who had been asked a simple question and was taking a moment to decide whether it was worth answering. Then he sat down. Not quickly. He took his time settling on the bench, adjusted it half an inch forward, set his feet against the pedals. He rolled his cuffs back once, the way a craftsman does before picking up a tool he trusts. His hands rested on his thighs for a moment. The room was still performing. A few last murmurs, a cough, the ghost of Hardcastle's smirk still floating in the air. But something else was in the room by then. Something the room hadn't put there. He looked at the keys, then he placed his hands on them. The opening bars of Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2 entered the room, the way a heavy door swings open onto a view you were not expecting, unhurried, inevitable, already enormous. I want to be precise here because I am a man who deals in precision, and I have no interest in exaggeration. The first phrase was not loud. It was not a declaration. It was an announcement. The way a well-made argument announces itself at its opening line, with a kind of quiet authority that tells you immediately that what is coming will require your full attention. The bass notes settled under the room like a foundation being laid. The right hand moved above them in a melody that was both stately and slightly wild, and every person in that ballroom who had been about to take a sip or complete a sentence found that they had, without deciding to, stopped. Hardcastle's smile was still present. I watched it. It lasted through the first phrase. By the third phrase, it had changed shape. It was still there, but it had lost its certainty. It was doing what smiles do when they are no longer connected to what a man actually feels. Holding on by force of habit, a flag still flying when the wind has died. The rhapsody opened into itself. There is a quality to that piece, and I am not a musician, merely a man who has lived long enough to hear it more than once. There is a quality to it of the plains, of something bigger than the room it is played in, that carries within it both the memory of old grief and the complete indifference of joy. It does not ask your permission to affect you. Cody Raines played it like a man speaking his own language. The slow opening section built in the way of weather, patiently, with gathering purpose. His left hand commanded the bass with an authority that had nothing performative about it. The sound was not a boy playing a difficult piece. It was a musician in full possession of the thing he was playing. He let the melody breathe where it wanted to breathe and pressed it forward where it wanted to press. His face was still, his body was still, only his hands moved, and they moved with the particular economy of the deeply skilled. Nothing wasted, nothing rushed. I noticed, perhaps 3 minutes in, that the room had rearranged itself. I don't mean people had moved, though one or two had, quietly, drawing closer. I mean the space between the piano and the listeners had changed its nature. The distance that usually exists in that kind of room between a performance and an audience. The polite, evaluative, socially protected distance of people who are watching rather than hearing had collapsed. We were not watching. We were, every one of us, simply in it. Old Reverend Cates had his eyes closed. Mrs. Hardcastle had sat down on a chair near the sideboard. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she was looking at the boy with an expression that said she had known exactly what was going to happen, and was, nonetheless, moved to see it. The fast section came. It arrived like a change of weather, sudden, complete, the entire character of the room shifting in a single bar. His hands flew, but that is not the right word, because flying suggests something weightless, and this had weight, every note placed, every phrase shaped, the left hand keeping its ground like a man who knows exactly where he stands, while the right hand ran through passages of such velocity and precision that I found myself, absurdly, leaning forward, as if proximity would help me understand how it was being done. The chandelier above us trembled gently in the vibration of the bass. Hardcastle had set his glass down. I saw it from on the corner of my eye. He set it on the nearest surface, slowly, without looking at it, the way a man sets something down when both his hands and his mind have been required elsewhere. He was standing very still. His expression had passed through several countries and arrived somewhere I had not seen on his face before. Not embarrassment, not merely surprise, something deeper, less comfortable, and more honest. The rhapsody surged. It climbed. Cody's right hand moved through the high passages with a kind of reckless precision. Risks taken and landed. A phrase turned at the last possible moment, in a direction you hadn't expected, but immediately understood, was the only correct one. The room was entirely silent except for the piano. 12 minutes in, I realized that no one had coughed or shifted since the slow section ended. No one had moved. The final bars built to their peak the way a wave builds. You can see it coming, you know where it is going, and the knowing does nothing to reduce the force of it when it arrives. He played the last passage with both hands thundering together, the low notes rolling under the high ones, and then, with an unhurried authority that struck me as the single most elegant gesture of the entire performance, he allowed the final chord to ring. It rang for what felt like a long time. Then it faded. His hands came to rest on his thighs. He looked at the keys for a moment, the way a man looks at something he has just finished building, and then he looked up. The silence lasted 5 full seconds. I counted. Then the room broke. Not politely, not the measured applause of people who want to acknowledge. Something without committing to it. It was the kind that happens before the mind decides to make it happen. The colonel was first on his feet. Mrs. Hardcastle was already standing. The man beside me was clapping so hard I could feel it in the air. Even Reverend Cates, who I had assumed was asleep, was on his feet and nodding with the whole of himself. Hardcastle walked to the piano. He walked slowly, and the room quieted to watch him. He stopped in front of the bench and looked down at Cody Raines, who sat still, waiting, with no particular expression on his face. Then Hardcastle put out his hand. The boy shook it. "Salome is yours," Hardcastle said. Not loudly, quietly. The way a man speaks when the thing he is saying is both true and costs him something. "First thing tomorrow, I'll have the papers drawn." He paused. Then he added in a voice that I think only I and the boy and perhaps Mrs. Hardcastle fully heard. "I don't know where you learned that, but I am glad you learned it here." He picked up his glass and walked away. The conversation in the room resumed, fuller, warmer, the kind of talk that follows a shared experience, when strangers feel briefly like old friends. I found the boy alone near the door a while later, quiet, a little outside of things, watching the room with those steady eyes. I introduced myself. He nodded. I asked him where he'd learned. He told me his father had played, that the old upright from his father's house had been the first thing sold when his father died, 6 years ago, sold to cover the debts, and that he had not touched a piano again until he came to Broadfield and Mrs. Hardcastle left the ballroom, unlocked one evening, and he sat down, just to remember. I had nothing useful to say to that, so I said nothing. We stood for a moment. Across the room, the Bosendorfer sat in its corner, gleaming and unoccupied. The chandelier reflected softly in the lid. Was it worth it? I asked. Playing in there for that crowd? He thought about it. It's what the music wanted, he said simply. And then he thanked me for the conversation and walked back into the house, toward the stables. I drove home that night along the ridge road with the window down and the cold air coming in off the fields, thinking about a boy of 22 who had kept something alive in himself for 6 years, quietly in borrowed rooms, until the night it had somewhere to go. I have sat on the bench of many courtrooms. I believe in evidence. I believe in what can be demonstrated. That night I drove home believing in it still, only now I had a better sense of the forms it could take. The gray mare had a new owner, and the man who had wagered her, for the first time in 11 years of harvest balls, had come away from his own party with less than he'd arrived with, and looked, somehow, the better for it.